Okay, welcome back to Conversing Labs. This is Reversing Labs podcast where we talk to the top minds in threat intelligence, threat hunting, software assurance, and cybersecurity, of course. And so happy today to have our guest, Patrick Wardle, with us. Patrick, welcome.
Thanks, Paul. Stoked to be chatting with you again. Yeah, really great to be on the podcast. Looking forward to talking to you today.
So we're talking to you. You're actually in Spain right now, and so there's a little bit of a delay. But for the folks who aren't familiar with you and your work, Patrick, just tell us a little bit about yourself and about Objective-C.
Yeah, so my name is Patrick Wardle. I am a passionate Mac security researcher, and I've really kind of put this passion, this love into a nonprofit called the Objective-C Foundation, and we do currently three main things. First and foremost, I create free open source Mac security tools, the kind of Objective-C tool suite, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, firewall products, tools to monitor microphones, detect persistent malware, that kind of stuff. Also the author of the recently published The Art of Mac Malware. It's a book describing how to analyze Mac malware. It's fully free, available online, also published by No Starch Press. And then finally, I also organized the Objective by the Sea Mac Security Conference. The reason I'm actually in Spain is that's coming up in October in a few months here in Europe, in Spain. And we bring top speakers, researchers from all over the world in a community-focused conference to talk about the latest Mac security and iOS security exploits, tools, malware, all the fun things.
Yeah, you are kind of the Obi-Wan Kenobi of Mac malware and Mac security. But
wait, isn't he dead?
I was going to say, I'm not making any predictions about how this is going to turn out, but that is really kind of what you're known for. Not just Mac security, but over the years, you've discovered a lot of really interesting kind of vulnerabilities or malicious code lurking in otherwise kind of benign seeming applications. I think the last time we spoke was back in 2020. You discovered a couple really serious bugs in the Zoom application right at the onset of the pandemic, when pretty much everyone and their mother was using Zoom for everything. So this is kind of your background. And How did you get interested just in working on the Mac platform? Obviously, as a threat person, most of what's out there is Windows based. So how did you get interested in Mac?
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. And it kind of fell into it almost by accident. So, in a prior life, my younger days, I was working at the National Security Agency, the NSA, where I was a malicious code analyst and also then working on creating, let's just say, offensive cyber capabilities. When I left, I went to help start a company, and I wanted to be able to use the same foundational skills, reverse engineering, tool writing, but not stepping on any toes, right? You don't want to piss off the NSA. And so I said, hey, there's this kind of like new, at least to me, platform. It's OS X at the time, right? Kind of not even Mac OS. And I could see its popularity was increasing. And I said, cool, like if I transition to this, because at the NSA, I was doing only Windows research and work, that, I won't be, stepping on anyone's toes, but I can use the same skills, analyzing malicious code, writing tools, et cetera, et cetera. So in retrospect, it was a very auspicious decision, and I have the NSA indirectly to thank for that. But that's really how I got involved and interested in the Mac OS platform. Very quickly, I saw this need, there was this gap for especially security tools. The story I always like to tell is I had a friend in Hawaii. He was a surfboard shaper, and his Mac computer got hacked. It was, adware. There was pop-ups, really kind of standard stuff. And he said, "Hey, Patrick, you do computers. Fix my stuff." Right? This is the struggle all of us in this field face, fixing friends and relatives' computers anytime something goes wrong. So I said, yeah, sure. And I was like, okay, well, on Windows, I would download sysinternals, auto runs, see what was persistently installed. And then from that, very easily find malware. And so I said, okay, where's the auto runs for Mac OS? And, this was 2012-ish, and there wasn't one. And I said, interesting. So I kind of whipped together this embarrassingly bad Python script that enumerated login items, launch daemons, launch agents, brought it back, ran it on his computer, and it, uncovered the adware, which wasn't that sophisticated. But that to me was the kind of light bulb moment that, hey, there's a need for these tools, because at that time too, me as a Mac user, I wanted to say, hey, what's persistently installed on my computer? And there wasn't an easy way, a comprehensive way to do that. So that was kind of nice. And I also got a custom surfboard out of the deal. So I was like,
Yes.
man, win-win. So
Yes.
that's kind of the longish answer to how I got into Mac and how the focus on Mac security tools really came to fruition.
Yes, for listeners, Patrick is a resident of the beautiful state of Hawaii, and so having a custom surfboard that comes in handy.
Key.
Here in Massachusetts, doesn't have quite the same value.
You can like surfboard down, snowboarding, right?
There's some surfing here, just not.
There's some parallels.
The same.
Yeah.
And really interestingly, you set this up again. Objective-C Foundation, it's a nonprofit, so you really set this up instead of kind of cynically going out there and just deciding to make a lot of money off this. You set it up as a nonprofit. Just talk about that decision.
Yeah. So from the beginning, everything I wanted to be, free, and not everything was open sourced at the beginning, which is what we'll talk about today. And the reason why is exactly because of the topic we're going to dive into. But my tools are focused on end users. And really, I thought that, end users, in my opinion, shouldn't pay for security tools. I mean, there's been a few interesting cases over the years that have really kind of reiterated that to me. One I always talk about deals with this malware called Fruitfly. Fruitfly was around for about 10 years before it was discovered. It was written by allegedly by this individual who wrote some custom malware to target Macs. And allegedly what he would do is, and I say allegedly because he's, awaiting trial and, got to be a little careful here. He would deploy these to hack into Mac systems, deploy it, and then he would turn on the webcam to spy on individuals. And a lot of his victims were children, which, that's really just gross, right? And so, to me, I always thought that if these individuals had been using even basic security software, something that perhaps alerts you about the webcam coming on. Because what this individual allegedly would do is wait till the people were not in front of the computers, then his malware would turn on the webcam. The indicator light would come on, but they'd be in the bedroom or something, and so they wouldn't see that. And he would spy on these people for over a decade. The FBI got involved. They went so far to set up kind of like helplines with psychologists to when they, alerted the victims, the parents say, hey, like your child has been spied on for the last 5 years. I mean, that's like emotionally, like just even incomprehensible.
Yep,
so to me, and I was like, from a security point of view, like if they were running basic security tools, like we could have caught this a lot earlier and maybe prevented some really, damaging situations. And again, the malware wasn't super sophisticated, so even simple security tools. And so part of the reason was, a lot of people thought Macs couldn't get malware, and this is, Apple marketing. So there's, one of the things I really always like to focus on is that, hey, Macs are computers. They're going to have malware. They're going to have vulnerabilities. But then also, hey, can we make free open source security tools so that end users can add that extra layer of protection to hopefully prevent, the next Fruitfly or everything in between. And so that was always the mission. It aligned really well with the idea of a nonprofit, really just focus on doing community activities. I see a huge, the adversaries are getting very sophisticated as Macs become very prevalent in the enterprise. They're targeting Macs more and more. And there's really this gap where there's not as many Mac security researchers, Mac malware analysts. So, if I can share my expertise or help organize conferences to bring speakers to bring awareness to this problem, it's really a win-win for everyone in the industry, us as defenders. So the nonprofit seemed to be a natural fit. And, I have a lot of really amazing companies that sponsor that too. So, I have to give a lot of credit and thanks to them as well, because they recognize what we're doing. And that's kind of why this can all come to fruition. So it's really this joint effort, community focus, and something I'm really proud about.
That's great. So I reached out to you, Patrick, because you're doing a talk with a colleague and researcher at Johns Hopkins University, Tom McGuire, at the Black Hat Conference, which is next week. And it's a little bit off your usual. I mean, again, you're best known for delving into Mac security issues and Mac malware. This is a little bit different. And the talk is called Déjà Vu, and you're really talking about a pattern or that you've seen of really code theft and reuse that might be getting missed by organizations that are doing software development. So could you talk first, I guess, how you got turned on to this subject?
Great question, Paul. And again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this, because I think this is a systemic issue that's affecting the community in a negative way. And I think just bringing awareness to the issue will allow us to really move forward positively and kind of squash this. But, again, having awareness is really, I think, what was missing in the first place. My Black Hat talk is basically on the issue of corporations stealing algorithms essentially from Objective-C's tools and re-implementing them in their commercial products, which is obviously not okay. And so how I stumbled across this was kind of humorous in retrospect.
I'm not just a researcher, I'm a victim too.
Actually, yeah. And so this client said, "Hey, Patrick, we have some files that are antivirus flagged. You take a look, is that adware, something more we should be worried about?" And I was looking at one of them, and it was one of these pup products, right? This potentially unwanted software. And so I was like, it's good to get this out of your network, but it's not something that's super worrisome. But as I was looking through this potentially unwanted program, it was like one of these fake security products, and it basically said, "Hey, we can alert you when your mic or your webcam is being utilized." And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." I was like, "Yeah, my tool does that too." And I was like, "There's many ways to do this, so I'm interested in how they're doing that." And I started looking through their code. I was like, "Oh, okay, this is similar to my code." And then I was like, "Wow, this is exactly like my code." And we'll talk a little bit more later of what that is, because, there's some gray area where, just because someone's using the same approach, right, they could be equally inspired or stumbled across it. But, when they're using the same hard-coded constants, when their code has the same bugs from your code, it really turns into this, verbatim, almost plagiarism that really, to me, crosses the line. And so that was kind of interesting, but I kind of brushed it off. I was like, well, it's this shady company, like, no surprises, I'll ping them and see if we can resolve this. Fast forward a few years. Recently, my tool Oversight, which monitors the mic and webcam to detect things like the fruit fly malware we talked about, broke. And as you mentioned, first and foremost, I'm a security researcher. I do write tools, but I always say I'm not like an expert software engineer. So the way I write tools sometimes is a little janky, very unique, and especially in the context of oversight, this is especially true because Mac OS provides no simple way to answer the question, what program or application is accessing the mic or the webcam? So it's very easy to get a notification that the mic or the webcam has been activated, but then to determine who, what product, what application is not. There's basically no deterministic way, which is unfortunate, because if it's something like Zoom or FaceTime or Skype, that's fine. You want to allow that and move on. But if it's an unsigned piece of malware running in the background, that's like big red flag, and will show that your system has been infected. And so that was Oversight's killer feature, was the ability to uniquely identify what process or application. And as I mentioned, it did that in kind of a janky way. And I'll get into that in the talk, but basically, I'm looking for mock ports. I'm like sampling the candidate process and looking for strings in the stack trays. I'm running Apple utilities and parsing the output from standard out, like things that are, kind of hackerish, right? Like how a security
kind of a kitchen sink
write,
approach.
Yeah, and it worked really well, but it wasn't elegant. So when Apple changed some of the operating system, my tool broke horribly, and I got all these bug reports, and I was like, yeah, not surprising. I should fix this. So I was kind of Googling around to see what Apple had changed, and I found other bug reports, and I was like, man, my tool is broken everywhere. But then I read the responses, and people pointed out that, oh no, this is another company's product, and I was like, this is a very specific niche bug. Like, it's interesting that these other companies are utilizing that. So I did some analysis on their tool, and again, found out they utilize the exact approach that my tool Oversight had, which at the time was closed source. So that means they had to reverse engineer it. And again, they copied it so specifically that they copied the bugs in my code. And the analogy is it would be like, plagiarism, where someone's plagiarized your writing so much that they plagiarize spelling mistakes and grammar. Yeah. And so it's kind of like, okay. So at that point, I was like, there's others out there. I wrote some Yarrow signatures to detect my algorithm, ran it across the network and found some other companies. And so the end result was that I found several completely unrelated companies that had all implemented webcam and microphone monitoring in their commercial tools in a way that was identical to Oversight.
And not all of them shady, kind of, low profile. Yeah.
No. And that, like the first one, I was like, unsurprising with these other ones. I was like, man, these are very well-respected cybersecurity companies.
How did you go about determining that that their code was more or less identical to your code? What was the process involved in doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I kind of alluded to the fact that there's some gray area here where if a company or a product is doing something similar, that could just be coincidence, or even if they were influenced by your tool, like, is that copying? Is that, inspiration, right? And so the process then became, and this is how my colleague Tom got involved. Tom is a instructor professor at Johns Hopkins. He teaches reverse engineering, operating security. I mean, he's like just a top tier, incredible human, brilliant. And so I said, hey, Tom, I have some products, and, I think they're verbatim copying, but, I'm a little biased, I'm a little defensive, right? It's always good to kind of bring in someone who's maybe not as vested, especially when we're making accusations, right? And I was like, hey, can we collaborate together? And basically, here's my algorithm. Here's the source code for it. Here's how it looked in disassembly. And then here are these other commercial products, right? We only have the compiled binaries. So, in a debugger or disassembler. So then it became a very kind of low level exercise where we would basically look for equivalencies, which, in some senses seems difficult, especially some of these were written in, Swift, different programming languages. The equivalences actually then started to fall out really quickly. Like, for example, I would query the IO registry on Mac OS for specific key value pairs, which would, contain the PID of one of a handful of processes that had accessed the mic and webcam recently. And if you Google these same strings, there's 0 hits. Similarly, how I parse the output from Apple's utility that can enumerate mock ports, because again, an application or a product that's talking to the mic or the webcam, whether that's FaceTime or malware, under the hood, there's going to be mock messages sent back and forth. So if you enumerate those messages, you can see perhaps who is responsible for accessing the mic and the webcam. Well, you can't do that directly. You don't have the correct permissions and entitlements, but there's command line utilities that ship with Mac OS that you can execute, but then you have to parse their output, right? And so there's a million ways to parse output, right? Like a real software engineer would probably use a regular expression. Patrick goes over 3 characters and then looks for a comma, and then, it's just very janky. But you then see this exact parsing approach in another tool. You're like, they're not even trying to hide this. So once you add all of that cumulatively, you're right, there's these undocumented strings that, again, aren't on Google, this exact same approach, and then they have the same bugs because of bugs in my code. You can make a very compelling report. And, especially, once you're doing a side-by-side comparison, it's the code doesn't lie. And there's really no other explanation of how this was, done so exactly the same, other than it was essentially.
Okay, so you found these similarities and then presumably reached out to the offending companies?
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting because, and I really, talk about this in my talk, because it's like, okay, now what? And it's interesting because I had very different experiences. And there's a variety of challenges, and I think we'll get into this more, kind of talking about what can corporations do when they're approached by this. The good thing is most companies have mechanisms where you can report intellectual property issues. You can always reach out to the security team. And so what I did was I wrote, the first important thing is I have to realize what I want. And, do I just want an apology? Do I want financial compensation? Do I want, to name and shame them? Really, what is the goal?
Is
And
there an
then
all of the above
also,
option?
hey, how can I provide maybe, but most
D.
most companies are not going to want to be disparaged. Let's just say D for disparagement. And so then I would spend hours putting together a very detailed report describing my tool, showing my algorithm, talk about the bugs in my code, the similar bugs, showing bug reports on their website from their users, talking about the binary code side by side, and then I would present that to them and say, hey. This is now the best case scenario, and this happened sometimes, was that CEO would get involved and say, "Hey, we're super sorry. Like, put this in an email." I was like, "Wow, how can we fix this? This is something that shouldn't happen. We're taking proactive steps. We're gonna remove this from this code. Can we acquire a license? How can we financially compensate you?" And that's best case scenario because it really gives the opportunity for an amicable win-win resolution, which I think is the goal. You run into scenarios too, then, especially with larger companies who, if I put myself in their shoes, they're often approached by patent trolls and, the legal team, and their default response is, yeah, no, we don't see any equivalency here. We're going to do an internal investigation. We didn't find anything. And that's very frustrating. And, then as a security researcher, you really have to think about, hey, can you provide them more information? I had one where there was like, it's us versus you. And I'm like, fair, like I'm saying this and you're saying that. But, I'm like, this is what I do. Like, I will stake my career on this. Like, I'm so confident in this and the code doesn't lie. Eventually they kind of come around, but you do have to sometimes realize that, especially dealing with intellectual property experts, they might not understand exactly what's going on, right? They'll have someone that runs like a code equivalency tool across the two products and be like, it says it's 90% different. And you're like, well, obviously, but that 10% is, copied verbatim and found nowhere else.
Right.
That's really what we're talking about. So you really have to, do some negotiating and put on a hat, realizing that, who you're talking with. And what I found was really helpful is
it's like, you stole 100% of my stuff, but it's only 10% of your application. That's kind of that's the message.
Yeah, that's like kind of started. I was like, come on. But you have to realize you're dealing with lawyers and their goal is to deflect and mitigate. And so I found that, when I kind of stepped up my game, I reached out to EFF and said, hey, I'm having some trouble here. They were incredible. They said, hey, we'll provide you pro bono legal advice, which is kind of one of the things that EFF offers, which is incredible. And then you can go back and say, okay, hey, I'm working with EFF. They're helping me out too. Very quickly, the conversation changes, which is unfortunate, but sometimes I guess you have to play the game.
It's the reality of the legal world, which is being right is really just part of the thing. You can be right, but it's really about how much are you willing to pay to fight this, and how much ambiguity is there?
Exactly. And and really, talking to lawyers, and this is an important thing as well. It's if you haven't like patented an algorithm, right? It's difficult to, from a legal point of view, especially depending what market it is. In the EU, there's specific directives that say if you reverse engineer a tool to create a competing product, that's illegal, right? But that's in the EU, right? This is another country that might not apply. If you haven't patented the algorithm, there's also some gray areas. Damages are often awarded based on, or rewards are based on damages. If your tool is free, like they're like, okay, we stole, and like, so really the angle too that I think is really important is optics, right? Corporations aren't going to want to be essentially called out and said, hey, you guys clearly stole from a nonprofit. And so, that's, I think, an angle that security researchers can play into, for better or worse. It's kind of like, if you want Apple to change something, like, bad press is the best way to do that. And, that's just kind of the reality. So that was also a lesson learned, like kind of what angle to take. Like, it's not like I'm going to sue you because they're going to out lawyer you and have more money. It's kind of like, do I want to publicly talk about this? And I will,
Yeah.
or can we figure out a way to resolve this? So that was kind of an interesting learning experience for me, I would say.
As you think about this, is it your impression that the lifting of your code was a decision of maybe an individual developer who have been tasked with developing these features, or a
Exactly.
top-down, hey, time to market, let's just borrow some of what's already out there?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because that's something I had the wrong answer to going in. Originally, the title of my talk was like Evil Corpse. I was like, these, I'm going to bleep myself, are like stealing from me as a, independent security researcher for my nonprofit, like they're greedy. And then really once I kind of talked to, the C-level execs at the team, the developers, it really became very apparent that almost always there was an individual who had been tasked with adding a feature, and it was like, cool, this is a good feature. We want our cybersecurity product to monitor the mic and the webcam. Our Windows product has this. We want parity on Mac OS. How do we do this? And talking to one of the companies, they said, Oversight, your tool, was the only one that did that. And so, the researcher, the developer who was tasked with adding this feature, reverse engineered your tool and incorporated that. And and they were like, we obviously don't condone that. We're really sorry about that. It's not who we are. And so that was almost the case across the board, which I think is good in a way, right? It's not like there's this grand conspiracy that these corporations are out to steal from nonprofits, at least in the cybersecurity industry, because, we're kind of in the same space here. It's more that individuals, maybe don't understand the ethics of it, or there's no repercussions. And, to be fair, if I put myself in those developers' shoes, not to condone what they did, but all the companies I've worked at, when a feature is requested, no one's ever been like, how did you come up with this? Right. And, I know it's, and for me, ethically, I'm not going to steal somebody else's code. But, for others, maybe it's a gray area. And if the corporations aren't asking these questions or enforcing that, it kind of slips through the cracks. And so to answer your question, it always seemed that it was the case of one misguided individual who would then ultimately be responsible for that.
Okay, so the big question is, for organizations out there, how do they go about figuring out if this is happening with their own code? You mentioned you wrote some Yara rules to help you find other examples of this. So I'd be interested in knowing what's in the Yara rules. But also your situation is a little bit unique because there aren't that many programs, applications that do what yours do, right? So, it's a thin population out there to look within. So how would you go about even looking? Some of the scenarios you described seem almost kind of happenstance, like OS 10 change and it creates problems, and you're Googling around, and you're finding other problems that sound like that.
Yeah.
So how do you do this as a company? How do you operationalize that?
That's a great question. I think there's two things to this, right? It's like, how do you look for this? And then also how to make sure that's not happening within. And so part of my talk is we're talking about both of these. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Unfortunately, I don't know of a silver bullet, a panacea approach to finding this. So I kind of talk about the approaches that I utilize, which I think are good steps. But yeah, like you said, there's not necessarily a really good way to do that. And so first is identifying what's unique about your tool. And then step one is kind of identifying competitors that might advertise the same feature or capability, right? If you add something kind of new and then 6 months later you see your competitor adding the same feature, like
red flag.
Clearly not saying they stole it, right? They could have re-implemented or maybe take a peek. Unfortunately, other than reverse engineering, you're really not going to know. And so, the source code's not available. So, what worked really effective is like matching bug reports. I don't think that's necessarily like best approach, right? Hopefully your product doesn't have bugs in the first place. But for me, that worked really, really well. As I mentioned, and you kind of touched on again, if you can write a detection signature for your algorithm, my approach in Oversight, which is now open source so everyone can see, is like super, we mentioned kind of janky, very unique. So you can basically then write a detection signature for certain strings that are in your binary and then run it virus total, ReversingLabs, any site that has a corpus of binaries. I would imagine certain companies have better ways to do this, but as an individual security researcher, that was kind of my approach. So, but I think that can still apply if you're a company, and kind of the red flags you mentioned. You see a competitor with the same approach. Maybe take a peek to see how that's going. So that's kind of like, how do you detect it? That it's happening to you. And this is also a good time to talk about closed source versus open source. So the only reason my tools were
You
initially
anticipated my next question. Yeah, go ahead.
closed source was to, I thought, make this a little more difficult. And I know, obviously, you can reverse engineer anything, but I thought that would be a barrier enough that people would like say, yeah, I can reverse engineer this to get the algorithm, but I'm not going to do that. Where when something's open source, there's a little more gray area, and it's like, well, it's sitting here on GitHub and like that. So that's, I learned very quickly, is completely a misnomer, that closed versus open source. So now all my tools are open source, which also then means, because they're like GPL'd and stuff now, if the company does use this, in some ways there's maybe more legal standing to go after them, because now it's like they're a GPL violator. And you still probably don't want to take that to court, but I think that's more well established, the lines that are drawn there. So that was a good learning experience to me.
So as part of GPL, they would need to contribute back any modifications they made to the GPL code, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So it kind of, I think, it kind of articulates a little bit more what the expectations are. But again, the takeaway for me, I was like, well, people are stealing. I'm going to make everything open source, because I believe that's better transparency anyways. And again, that was the only reason they were originally closed source. So now, everything's open source. So, push me in that direction anyways.
Yeah. And there is obviously so much of application development these days relies so heavily on open source. There is obviously this culture of kind of, just grabbing stuff and using it and cobbling together applications based on stuff other people's written. But in this case, that code wasn't necessarily there to be grabbed and reused, right? It was closed source at the time. And so I guess so lessons learned for you going forward. Obviously, you open sourced your applications, and that creates a more clear legal framework for maintaining the integrity of that. Other lessons learned?
Another lesson I learned, which doesn't really apply to me, but I think applies to the companies and corporations, is just like, what can you do to make sure that this isn't happening, that developers within the organizations aren't inadvertently doing that? Because again, the lesson learned for me was that is what was happening, right? Versus evil corp stealing, from the small nonprofit. And talking to these companies who were fairly amicable once they realized that I wasn't just some patent troll, that hey, like, let's work together to fix this. I'm really not trying to like burn you to the ground. Let's professionally resolve this. Was they said, hey, we have mechanisms in place to make sure open source software isn't inadvertently used, right? Like if something's licensed, we have the lawyers review it. We're scanning for that, which is good, because they don't want to get in a position where they're using things incorrectly. But they said, hey, we didn't have any mechanism in place for this. And so there's huge opportunities for educating, I think, the developers. As I mentioned, none of the companies I ever worked at like sat down and told me this was illegal or asked me where I got features from. I knew from an ethical point of view that's stealing. Apparently, not everyone knows that. But, I think if corporations just added that, or when a new feature comes that's certain, like very unique, it's kind of just saying like, hey, like, how did you come up with this? And like, don't steal it from other tools, and talk about the implications, because the problem is it puts these corporations in some legal hot water potentially, which they want to avoid. And from an optics point of view, it really puts them in an awkward position,
reputation
which they
damage,
fully want to avoid. Yeah, exactly. So if I come out and it's like XYZ is stealing from a nonprofit, here's the proof, like, especially, because I have a platform where I can talk about this, that's something they really want to avoid. And also a lot of these companies, I believe they do like to adhere to ethics. They want to do the right thing. And so I think there's this kind of blind spot where they kind of missed out on that, and really, so one of the lessons is, what can they do? And I think there's some very easy steps, like I mentioned, talk to your developers, articulate what's acceptable and not acceptable. If you're reverse engineering closed source products to re-implement algorithms, that's very gray area, and kind of stay away with that. Because there's other options, right? Like if they reached out and said, hey, we want to license this, I would have been very open to that conversation. So that would have been a more professional way, and in the long run would have been more of a win-win. So I think a lesson is for corporations to realize this can happen and proactively take steps to avoid that. And then for their benefit, that will be the best approach as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, we teach kids in school, right? In middle and high school, you're learning like, here's what plagiarism is. You can't take somebody else's words and represent ideas, represent them as your own. You've got to quote them and cite that, and so on. Yeah. And so that's hopefully part of your education as a student on how to, create new expression. But in the development community, like you said, I think a lot of developers understand it just intuitively, but my sense is it probably isn't an explicit part of their developer education. Like, hey, don't steal other people's code and represent their work as yours.
And it is putting the corporations at risk, as I mentioned. So it does behoove the corporations to be proactive about this, both to make sure it's not happening to them, but I would say even more so that, an individual developer, who doesn't see this being as clear cut and black and white, really knows, hey, this is not something we condone or support.
Patrick Wardle of Objective-C Foundation. First of all, anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to say?
No, thank you again so much for giving me an opportunity. I think the fact that we're able to bring this to light is a really positive thing. I noticed some of the companies who were initially a little apprehensive about talking to me about this or addressing this. Once I was like, hey, I'm giving a Black Hat talk about this, they really quickly changed their tune, which is unfortunate. I feel, though, I was in a position where I have a large audience, so they kind of had to take me serious, where other developers who are, doing just as great work as I am, but might not have that audience, don't quite have that pressure, and maybe would just get swept under the rug. So I think by bringing awareness to this problem, I think we can kind of hopefully squash it, because it does seem to be fairly systemic. But as we mentioned, with simple solutions where even corporations can implement some safeguards and.
It's a really important topic, and we're focusing more and more obviously on software supply chain and so on. A lot of that is about malicious components working their way into your applications and your environment, of course. But not only, right? And this is kind of part of the conversation as well, which has to do with, the integrity and the provenance of the code that you're representing as your own.
No, and that's a really good point too, because, I remember a case in some of my intellectual property classes at Johns Hopkins where, they talked about people who would publish phone books would put fake numbers in. So if someone copied that, they could prove that was the case. And so it's like, if your developers are going to add bugs specifically that, might not trigger, but, unique fingerprints, watermarks in your code to prove that. And, that's something I think about.
I see a Black Hat talk in this, or maybe this is a DEF CON talk, actually.
Consciously. Yeah, maybe. But now, after talking to you, I'm like, oh, this is a good idea, because again, proving the equivalency, especially when you're talking to the legal team, is challenging. So, as a developer, again, if this happens to you, feel free to reach out. I would say prepare to have patience, especially when dealing with legal teams. But again, I'm hoping just being able to talk about this more transparently will really move us all in a positive direction.
We will include your contact information when we post the conversation, the ConversingLabs episode. And Patrick Wardle of Objective-C Foundation. The talk at Black Hat is Déjà Vu, Uncovering Stolen Algorithms in Commercial Products. And it's next Thursday, the 11th, a week from today, out in Las Vegas in Black Hat. And so everybody should check it out. Patrick, thanks so much for coming on and talking to us on ConversingLabs podcast.